Every artist fears the same thing, that one day, the person they've created will consume the person they actually are. Prince understood this better than most. For 20 years, he'd been the androgynous genius, the sexual provocateur, the man who made parents clutch their pearls and teenagers worship at his altar. But alone in Paisley Park, surrounded by platinum records and Grammy Awards, he felt hollow. The performances were flawless. The music was brilliant. But something essential was missing, and no amount of applause could fill that void. Then came Larry Graham. Not with a record deal, not with a collaboration offer, but with a question that cut through all the fame and costumes and carefully constructed mythology. Who are you when the music stops? It was 2001, and Prince was 43 years old. Old enough to have conquered the world, young enough to wonder if he'd conquered the wrong things. What happened next would horrify some fans and confuse others. But for Prince, it felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. The transformation was about to begin, and neither his music nor his life would ever be the same. If you want to discover the untold stories behind music's greatest transformations, hit that subscribe button now. This channel brings you the real moments that changed everything, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The year was 2001, and Prince was standing at a crossroads he didn't even know existed. He'd just finished another sold-out tour, another cycle of performances that left audiences breathless and critics scrambling for superlatives. But backstage at Paisley Park, after the final encore had faded and the crowds had dispersed into the Minneapolis night, he sat alone in his vast studio complex and felt nothing. Not exhaustion, not satisfaction, just a hollow emptiness that no amount of musical genius could fill. He'd built an empire on pushing boundaries, on being the one artist who answered to no one, who rewrote the rules of music and gender and sexuality with every album. But lately the costumes felt heavier. The performances felt mechanical. The applause felt distant, like it was meant for someone else entirely. They met at a concert where Graham's band was performing. Prince, who rarely attended other artists' shows anymore, had been drawn there by something he couldn't quite name. After the performance, they talked. Not about music, not about the industry, but about life, about the cost of being a genius, about the isolation that comes with being different, about the question that haunts every artist who lives long enough to ask it. What happens when the applause stops? Graham didn't pitch anything that night. He didn't offer salvation or promise answers. He simply shared his own story, and in that story, Prince recognized himself. The conversation lasted until 3 a.m, long after the venue had emptied and the crew had gone home. By the time they parted ways, something had shifted in Prince's mind. A door had opened that he hadn't known was there. The phone calls started slowly at first. Graham would check in, not to talk about music, but to ask how Prince was doing. Really doing, beneath all the performance and spectacle. But the real change happened internally, in ways that took months to manifest externally. Prince began questioning everything he'd built his career on. The sexually explicit lyrics that had scandalized parents and thrilled teenagers now felt hollow to him, like they belonged to a character he'd outgrown. The androgynous costumes that had been his trademark started to feel like chains rather than expressions of freedom. He looked at his vault full of unreleased music, thousands of songs representing decades of manic creativity, and wondered if any of it had brought him closer to the person he actually wanted to be. The question Graham had asked him that first night echoed constantly. Who are you when the music stops? By 2003, the transformation was impossible to hide. Prince released an album called The Rainbow Children that bewildered critics and fans alike. Gone were the sexual innuendos and party anthems. In their place were songs about spiritual awakening, redemption, and faith. The album opened with a spoken-word piece about divine love that sounded nothing like the Prince who dominated MTV in the 80s. Music journalists didn't know what to make of it. Some called it brave. Others called it career suicide. Most were simply confused. This was supposed to be Prince, the man who'd built his legend on provocation and boundary breaking. Now he was making what essentially amounted to gospel music. But the most shocking change wasn't in the music itself. It was in how Prince chose to live his life. He began going door to door in Minneapolis neighborhoods, sharing his newfound faith with strangers. Picture it. One of the most recognizable faces in music history, standing on suburban doorsteps with religious literature, asking homeowners if they had time to talk about spiritual matters. His commitment to his new faith extended into every corner of his life. He stopped swearing, even in private. He restructured his business dealings to align with his beliefs. When Warner Brothers wanted to re-release his back catalog with all the controversial content intact, Prince hesitated in ways he never had before. These weren't just songs anymore. They were artifacts of a person he was trying to leave behind. But transformation, real transformation, always comes with a price. Prince's decision to embrace his faith fully created rifts that would never fully heal. Former band members felt betrayed, like the music they'd created together had been retroactively dismissed as sinful or unworthy. Sheila E., who'd been both his percussionist and romantic partner, struggled to understand what had happened to the man she'd known. The physical toll of his transformation took longer to reveal itself. But it would prove devastating. Prince's interpretation of his faith included a strict stance against blood transfusions, viewing them as biblically forbidden. This belief would have profound consequences when his body began breaking down from decades of high-energy performances. His hips, worn from years of dancing in high heels and leaping from risers, deteriorated to the point where surgery became necessary. In 2010, he underwent a double hip replacement, but his religious beliefs complicated the procedure. Standard hip replacement surgery often requires blood transfusions. Prince's refusal to accept them meant the surgeries had to be performed under more risky conditions, and the recovery was more difficult than it should have been. The chronic pain that followed would haunt him for the rest of his life. And when doctors prescribed pain medication to manage that suffering, Prince found himself caught in a trap that his faith hadn't prepared him for. The pills that were supposed to help him heal became the chains of a new addiction, one that would ultimately prove far more dangerous than anything he'd left behind in his old life. What Prince didn't fully anticipate was how his spiritual transformation would isolate him even from the community he was trying to join. Being Prince, even a changed Prince, meant he could never fully integrate into the normal rhythms of congregational life. Even in a community that emphasized humility and equality, Prince remained separate, set apart by a celebrity status he could never fully shed. Larry Graham remained a steady presence through all of this, a mentor who understood the unique challenges Prince faced. Graham had navigated his own journey from funk legend to Jehovah's Witness, and he provided Prince with guidance that no one else could offer. They'd spend hours on the phone discussing scripture, faith, and the difficult balance between artistic expression and religious conviction. Graham never judged Prince for struggling. He understood that transformation is a process, not an event, and that someone with Prince's history couldn't simply flip a switch and become a different person overnight. In many ways, Graham became the father figure Prince had always needed, someone who valued him for who he was trying to become rather than who he'd been. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn, where all those choices that seemed like steps toward redemption became links in a chain leading to tragedy. Prince's hip problems worsened as he aged. The pain became constant, a dull ache that never fully disappeared. He managed it as best he could, relying on pain medication that doctors prescribed freely, perhaps too freely. What started as legitimate pain management slowly morphed into dependency. Prince, who'd avoided drugs and alcohol for most of his career, who'd built his legend on being in complete control of his faculties, found himself unable to function without the pills. His faith, which had given him so much purpose and direction, now became an obstacle to proper medical care. When the hip surgeries didn't fully resolve his pain, when the medication stopped working as effectively, when his body began breaking down from decades of punishing performance schedules, Prince needed more aggressive medical intervention. But his beliefs prevented him from accepting certain treatments. He couldn't accept blood transfusions. He was reluctant to undergo procedures that might conflict with his religious convictions. And so he suffered, managing his pain with increasingly dangerous doses of medication, trapped between a body that was failing and a faith that limited his options. The pills were supposed to be temporary. They were supposed to help him heal so he could get back to doing what he loved, creating music. But as months turned into years, the dependency deepened. Prince, ever the perfectionist who controlled every aspect of his career and image, couldn't control this. He hid it well. Even those closest to him didn't fully understand how serious the problem had become. He'd functioned perfectly during the day, performing at that same superhuman level that had defined his entire career. But at night, alone in Paisley Park, he'd need the pills just to sleep, just to silence the pain that never fully went away. As April 2016. Prince was 57 years old and planning another tour. On the surface, everything seemed fine. He was still performing, still creating, still the enigmatic genius who'd captivated the world for 4 decades. But behind the scenes, his body was failing. The pain had become unbearable. The pills that had once helped were now killing him, though he may not have fully understood that. On April 15th, his private plane made an emergency landing in Illinois. He'd collapsed, and his representatives called it the flu. But those close to the situation knew the truth. He'd overdosed and been revived with Narcan, a drug that reverses opioid overdoses. It was a warning, a clear sign that he needed serious help. 6 days later, on April 21st, Prince was found unresponsive in an elevator at Paisley Park. By the time paramedics arrived, he was already gone. The autopsy would later reveal that he died from an accidental overdose of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times more powerful than heroin. He'd taken what he thought were prescription Vicodin pills, but they were counterfeit, laced with a lethal dose of fentanyl. The man who transformed his entire life in search of meaning and purpose died alone in his studio complex, killed by pills he'd been taking to manage pain that might have been treatable if his religious beliefs hadn't complicated his medical care. The irony was devastating and impossible to ignore. Larry Graham had offered Prince a path to salvation, a way out of the emptiness that success had created. And Prince had taken that path with the same intensity and commitment he'd brought to everything else in his life. He'd transformed himself completely, changing not just his public image, but his entire worldview. He'd found the faith and purpose he'd been searching for. But in the process, he'd also placed himself in a position where his body's needs conflicted with his spiritual convictions. The pain that drove him to pills was partially caused by surgeries complicated by his refusal to accept blood transfusions. The dependency that killed him might have been avoided with more aggressive medical intervention that his faith wouldn't allow. In the aftermath of his death, people struggled to make sense of Prince's journey. Some saw his religious transformation as a tragic mistake, a wrong turn that led a brilliant artist away from his true calling and ultimately contributed to his death. Others saw it as a courageous attempt to find meaning beyond fame. a genuine spiritual awakening that brought him peace, even if it couldn't save him from physical decline. The truth, as always, was more complex than either narrative allowed. Prince's transformation was real. His faith wasn't a publicity stunt or a phase. He genuinely believed he'd found something more important than music, more lasting than fame. Larry Graham, who'd been the catalyst for all of this, was devastated by Prince's death. He'd tried to save his friend, to offer him a path out of the emptiness that celebrity creates. And in many ways, he'd succeeded. Prince's final years had been marked by a sense of purpose that his earlier life, for all its brilliance and success, had lacked. He'd found community, faith, and a reason to exist beyond the stage. But Graham also had to live with the knowledge that the transformation he'd helped trigger had unintended consequences. The religious convictions that gave Prince meaning also limited his medical options. The faith that filled his spiritual void couldn't protect him from physical pain or the addiction that grew from it. The music industry mourned a legend. Fans mourned an icon. But perhaps the most poignant loss was simpler and more human. A man who'd spent his entire life trying to figure out who he was had finally found an answer, only to have his time cut short before he could fully live into that identity. Prince had asked himself Larry Graham's question, "Who are you when the music stops?" He'd found an answer. He'd become a person of faith, a man who valued spiritual truth over artistic expression, who'd rather be anonymous and authentic than famous and hollow. But the music never really stopped for Prince. It couldn't. He was too talented, too driven, too fundamentally defined by his art to ever fully step away from it. Looking back at Prince's transformation through Larry Graham's influence, it's easy to focus on the tragedy of how it ended. But that would be missing something essential about the journey itself. Prince wasn't a victim of his faith. He was a man who made choices, difficult choices, about what kind of person he wanted to be. He could have continued as he was, churning out hits and maintaining the provocative image that had made him famous. No one would have blamed him. That's what legends do. They find a formula that works and stick with it until the end. But Prince couldn't do that. The emptiness was too great. The disconnect between his public persona and his private self had become unbearable. Larry Graham offered him an alternative, and Prince took it knowing full well that it would cost him. The question Graham posed, "Who are you when the music stops?" is one that haunts every artist who lives long enough to face it. For most, there's no good answer because the music and the person have become so intertwined that separating them is impossible. Prince tried to find that separation. He tried to be Prince Rogers Nelson, the man of faith, rather than Prince the icon. He succeeded in ways that mattered to him, even if the world struggled to understand or accept the transformation. And if his journey ended in tragedy, if the pain and addiction and complicated intersection of faith and medicine ultimately claimed his life, that doesn't erase the genuine searching and growth that defined his final years. In the end, Prince's story isn't really about Larry Graham or Jehovah's Witnesses or religious transformation. It's about the fundamental human struggle to find meaning in a life that's exceeded every conventional measure of success. It's about the realization that fame, talent, and achievement can't fill the void that exists at the center of every human soul. It's about having the courage to admit that void exists, even when you're standing on top of the world. Prince looked at his life, at everything he'd built and achieved, and realized something was missing. That awareness alone sets him apart. Most people in his position would have ignored the feeling, numbed it with excess, or convinced themselves that the applause was enough. Whether you see his transformation as enlightenment or delusion, whether you think he found salvation or lost his way, you have to acknowledge the bravery it took to even attempt such a fundamental reinvention at the height of his powers. But perhaps there's something redemptive in the attempt itself. Prince could have coasted on his legacy, replaying the hits and collecting the checks until age or illness made performance impossible. Instead, he chose growth, change, transformation. Even knowing the cost, he chose authenticity over image, faith over fame, meaning over applause. Those choices didn't save him. They might have even contributed to his death. But they were his choices, made with full awareness and intention. And that counts for something. That counts for a lot. When the music finally stopped for Prince on that April morning in 2016, who was he? He was a man who tried to answer the hardest question anyone can face. He was a seeker who'd found something worth believing in. He was an artist who dared to imagine that there might be more to life than art. He was flawed and brilliant and broken and whole all at the same time. He was, at the end, exactly who he'd chosen to be, for better and worse. And maybe that's the most anyone can hope for. To die as the person you chose to become, rather than the person circumstances made you. Prince achieved that. The cost was everything. But so was the reward.